Snow lashed against the five-star hotel's glass, as if trying to shatter it. Inside, an old woman trembled in a thin coat, her frail hand gripping the edge of the reception desk. "Please. I only need a small corner to sit through the night. It's so cold out there." The manager didn't even bother to look up. "This is a hotel, not a winter shelter for the homeless. Please leave." A woman draped in fur standing nearby let out a scornful laugh. "People like her always have an excuse. Call security and have her dragged out." The old woman backed slowly toward the door, where the snowstorm howled, waiting. At that very moment, Rosalind Hayward set down her mop. 29 years old, a widow, with a mere $14 in her pocket. She was the only one who knew room 1907 had just been vacated, with no new guest arriving until morning. "Come with me," she said softly, gently taking the old woman by the elbow. "There's a warm place. You leave at dawn, before anyone finds out." "You're firing yourself doing this," the manager hissed. Rose didn't turn back. She knew exactly what she was risking, and she did it anyway. What she did not know was that the frail woman she had just saved was about to turn her entire life upside down and awaken a force this whole city was too terrified to even name. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness always has value. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next meaningful stories. The elevator carried the two of them up to the 19th floor in silence. The old woman leaned against Rose's shoulder, her breathing shallow and broken. Rose opened the door to room 1907, helped her sit on the edge of the bed, then pulled the thick blanket up over her frail shoulders. The room was warm, giving off a gentle heat that felt worlds away from the storm howling outside the window. The old woman looked around as though she couldn't believe her own eyes, and then those clouded eyes came to rest on Rose's face. Rose poured a cup of warm water from the carafe in the room, placed it in the woman's hands, and told her to rest, then leave early in the morning before the next shift came on duty. The old woman gripped Rose's wrist, her hand icy cold but holding on tightly, and in a trembling voice, she asked what her name was. Rose smiled and said her name was Rosalind, but everyone called her Rose. The old woman reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a small object wrapped in an old handkerchief, trying to press it into Rose's palm. Rose gently folded the woman's hand closed and pushed the little thing back toward her. She said she hadn't helped her to receive anything in return. All the woman needed to do was stay warm and get better. The old woman's eyes shimmered with tears. She looked at Rose for a long time, as though she were trying to commit every line of her face to memory, then softly said it had been a very long time since she'd met someone who didn't ask what she had to give. Rose didn't fully understand what she meant. She only thought they were the words of an exhausted old woman after a long night. She closed the door with great care and went downstairs. Bradford Vance was already waiting at the far end of the ground floor hallway, his arms folded across his chest, his face cold and quietly triumphant. He held her personnel file in his hand, turning the pages slowly, deliberately, so she would see. He said she'd just committed a serious violation of policy by letting a stranger into a guest room of the hotel, an offense enough to terminate her contract immediately. Rose stood straight and didn't lower her head. She said the old woman would only stay there for a few hours and would leave before any new guest arrived, and that she'd cause no harm to the hotel. Vance let out a mocking laugh and said rules were rules, and people like her always thought kindness could take the place of regulations. He wrote her name in the violation log, biting off each word as he told her this was her final warning, and that next time, she would have to pack her things and get out. Rose watched the tip of his pen move across the page. Her heart went quiet, but not a single tear fell. She was used to being judged by people sitting in warm rooms, while others stood outside in the freezing cold. She only nodded, said she understood, then turned away to continue the work she hadn't finished. Vance watched her walk off, his gaze lingering on her longer than usual, as if something was already being calculated inside his head, something she couldn't possibly guess. Her shift ended at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. Rose stepped out of the hotel. The storm had eased, but the cold still cut against her skin. She pulled her collar higher and walked to the first bus stop beneath the dim yellow streetlights. In her pocket, she still had those $14, enough for 3 days of food if she was careful. Her studio apartment was on the 4th floor of an old building, so small that if she stretched out her arms, she could touch both walls. She flipped the heater switch. The machine gave a raspy rattle, then died, as it did every night. She sat down on the only wooden chair, removed the chain from around her neck, and let the worn silver wedding ring rest in the hollow of her palm. Outside the window, the city was sinking beneath a white layer of snow. Rose closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. She didn't know that somewhere else in this city, a man had just received word that the woman he loved most in the world had disappeared during the storm, and he was tearing all of Seattle apart to find her. That silver ring had once belonged to a promise. Tom Hayward had slipped it onto Rose's finger on an autumn afternoon 6 years ago, beneath the porch roof of a small church on the outskirts of Seattle, when the two of them had nothing but love and a modest little savings account. Tom was an electrician, and his hands always carried the smell of metal and insulated wire, but they were the gentlest hands Rose had ever known. He used to say they weren't rich, but they had enough, and to him, that was more than enough. Then, one morning 18 months earlier, everything collapsed with a single phone call. An accident at a construction site, a failure that never should have been allowed to happen. Tom spent nearly 3 weeks in the hospital before he passed away, and during those 3 weeks, Rose signed one paper after another, without even having time to fully read the numbers printed on them. When he closed his eyes for the last time, she didn't only lose her husband, she also inherited a hospital debt that had climbed to $41,000, a number that clung to her like a shadow that never left. Before he died, on the final night when he was still clear enough to think, Tom wrote her a few lines on the back of an old bill, his handwriting trembling from the pain medication. He wrote that kindness was the only thing no one could ever take from her, even if life stole everything else away. Rose taped that piece of paper to the refrigerator door in her cramped apartment, and every morning when she woke, it was the first thing she saw. She no longer cried, not because she'd forgotten, but because she understood that tears couldn't pay the bills, and there was still one more person she had to take care of. That person was Caleb, her younger brother, only 20 years old, now in his second year studying architecture in Chicago. Caleb was the only hope their family had, the first person in their bloodline ever to step into a university lecture hall. Rose was the one who had co-signed his tuition loan, and at the start of every semester, the amount due kept her awake through many long nights. He had no idea how hard his sister was struggling. Rose had hidden all of it from him. Hidden the fact that she worked the night shift at the hotel. Hidden the fact that the heater in her apartment had been broken since the previous winter. Even hidden the meals when she ate nothing but dry bread and drank tap water so she could save money to send to him. Every weekend, when Caleb called, she always began with a smile he couldn't see through the phone but could surely feel in her voice. He asked how she'd been, whether work was all right. And Rose always answered that everything was fine, that she was a little busy but happy, and that he only needed to focus on studying well. He told her about his drawings, about his dream of one day designing homes for poor people, and Rose listened to every word, holding the phone tightly against her chest, as though she were holding the very future she was straining so hard to protect. Tonight, after placing the ring back on the chain and fastening it around her neck, Rose looked once more at Tom's words on the refrigerator door. She thought of the trembling old woman on the 19th floor, of the tears shining in the woman's eyes, of Vance's cold warning. She knew she had just put the only job that was keeping both her and Caleb alive in danger. Yet strangely, she didn't regret it. Because if she had walked past a human being shivering in a snowstorm and left her there, then she would have lost the only thing Tom had left her, the one thing even $41,000 of debt could never touch. Not far from downtown, on the highest floor of a dark glass building overlooking Elliott Bay, there was a room very few people were allowed to enter, and even fewer left looking the same as when they had gone in. In that room, the lights were kept low, just bright enough to reveal the faces of those seated there, but not enough to drive away the coldness that seemed to cover everything. Lucian Crowe sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his hands clasped together on the polished wood. He was 34 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too many things ordinary people would never want to see. The whole city knew his name, but almost no one dared say it aloud. People spoke of him in whispers, with the kind of fearful silence that followed whenever his car rolled past. He didn't need to raise his voice to make others tremble. His silence was more frightening than any threat. Tonight, in the middle of that room, a man was kneeling on the floor. He was someone Lucian had once trusted, someone Lucian had lifted up from nothing, given an education, given a position, even given the trust he rarely offered to anyone. And yet that man had betrayed him, feeding information to an outside force in exchange for a little worthless gain. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking, stammering out pleas that he'd been forced, that he'd had no other choice. Lucien didn't interrupt him. He let the man speak until he had nothing left. Let every excuse fall into the room's dead quiet. When the man finally stopped, Lucien only rose slowly, walked around the table, and came to a halt in front of the traitor. In a low, even voice, he said that in his world, a knife in the back didn't hurt as much as realizing the hand holding that knife was one he had once held himself. He said he could forgive weakness, but he would never forgive betrayal, because a man who had sold himself once would sell himself again. The man looked up, his face drained white, about to open his mouth and say something more, but Lucien had already turned away. He merely gave a small signal to the two men standing by the door. There was no loud sound, no violent scene, only the door opening and closing again, and the man kneeling on the floor was taken away, vanishing from the room as silently as he had once slipped into Lucien's trust. For those who lived in this world, that silence was clearer than any sentence. Lucien returned to his chair and looked out through the glass, where the city lights blurred behind the falling snow. He had just reached for the untouched glass of liquor on the table, when a young man, his most trusted aide, hurried in with a tension on his face that was far from ordinary. The man lowered his head, hesitated for a moment, then reported that she had disappeared again last night, that no one could reach her, and that the cars had searched every familiar street but still found no trace of her. In that single instant, Lucien's ice-cold face changed. The absolute calm that no enemy had ever been able to shake suddenly cracked by the smallest measure, revealing something very few people had ever seen in him, a raw and human fear. He shot to his feet, the glass of liquor pushed aside, his voice dropping low but sharp as a blade as he ordered every person mobilized, every street and every hidden corner of the city searched until she was found. Because in the entire empire he had built with ruthlessness and power, there was only one person who was his weakness, and he would rather lose everything than lose her. 3 days after that snowy night, Rose still went to work regularly, as though nothing had ever happened, trying to keep herself more discreet and quiet than usual, hoping Vance's warning would pass like so many others before it. But she didn't know that some traps were set not because she had done anything wrong, but simply because she had happened to stand in the wrong place at the wrong time. That afternoon, just as Rose had finished cleaning a row of rooms on the 12th floor, the alarm suddenly shrieked through the hallway, and only a few minutes later, 2 security employees appeared at both ends of the corridor and stopped her. The woman in the fur coat from that night, Celeste Marlowe, stood in the middle of the floor lobby with her face flushed red with anger, her hand pointing straight at Rose as she loudly accused her of stealing a diamond bracelet worth nearly $80,000 from her room, and the only person who had access to clean that room that morning was this housekeeper. Rose went numb. She felt as if the ground beneath her feet had just split open. She stammered that she had never touched any guest's belongings, that it was a rule she had followed absolutely through all her years in the job, but Celeste didn't give her a chance to finish. The woman hissed that poor people like her were always hungry for things that didn't belong to them, and that she had suspected Rose ever since the night Rose had dared to talk back in the hotel lobby. Just then, Bradford Vance appeared, stepping forward with a falsely grave expression, and instead of protecting his own employee, he immediately took the guest's side. He said the hotel valued its reputation very highly, that a serious accusation like this couldn't be taken lightly, and that he himself had long had doubts about her character. He ordered Rose suspended from work at once, took back her employee badge, and coldly declared that if she didn't voluntarily confess and return the item, he would have no choice but to call the police. Rose stood in the middle of that circle of prying eyes, feeling every insult like tiny needles piercing her skin. But inside that shock, something in her refused to let her collapse. She thought of Caleb, of the debt, of the words Tom had left on the refrigerator door, and she forced herself to stand straight. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't frantically defend herself in vain. She only looked directly into Vance's eyes, her voice trembling but clear, and said she hadn't taken anything, and that she believed the truth would speak for itself. She said this hotel had a system that recorded every time a keycard was swiped to open each room, with times and a clear access history, and anyone who truly wanted to find the truth could check it. For one extremely brief moment, Rose saw Vance's gaze falter slightly, a flicker of confusion that he quickly hid beneath irritation. It was that very moment that made her suddenly realize something, that perhaps this wasn't simply a theft case, and that the man standing in front of her was afraid of something he didn't want anyone to touch. Before leaving the hotel under the cold escort of security, Rose managed to do one thing that even she couldn't explain how she had thought of at that moment. As she passed the employee storage area, she quietly kept the magnetic keycard she had used during her morning shift, the card that recorded every trace of the rooms she had opened and the exact time of each entry. She clenched it tightly in her palm and hid it inside her inner coat pocket, as though she somehow sensed that it would be the only thing capable of speaking the truth when no one was willing to listen to her anymore. She stepped out into the cold, jobless, stripped of her good name, carrying an accusation that could send her to prison. But in her hand, she still held a small piece of evidence, and in her heart she still held the belief that kindness wouldn't be buried forever. They took Rose into a small room behind the hotel's security area, where there was only a metal table, 2 hard chairs, and a cold white light shining straight down. They told her to sit there and wait, said management was considering whether to call the police, and said that if she was smart, she should admit everything before it was too late. The door closed, leaving Rose alone among 4 silent walls. She sat there with both hands resting on her lap, and for the first time since everything had happened, she allowed herself to feel the full weight pressing down on her chest. If she was prosecuted, she wouldn't only lose this job, she would also lose any chance of finding another one with a theft conviction clinging to her name. The $41,000 debt would never be paid off, and Caleb, her younger brother working so hard over his drawings in Chicago, would have to drop out of school halfway through because there would be no one left to co-sign for him, his dream shattered simply because his sister had been accused of a crime she had never committed. In that darkest moment, when tears were already rising to the corners of her eyes, Rose lifted a hand to her chest and felt for the silver ring lying quietly beneath her shirt. She closed her eyes, and in her mind, Tom's words echoed again, that kindness was the only thing no one could ever take from her. She told herself that if she collapsed now, if she let fear swallow her whole, then the people who had set this trap for her would win, and the truth would be buried forever. She drew in a deep breath, opened her eyes, and the look in them had changed. It was no longer the stunned expression of a victim, but the sharp calm of someone determined to save herself. She knew no one was coming to rescue her. There was no husband to lean on, no lawyer she could afford to hire, no powerful family to call for help. She had only herself, and she had to be enough. Rose began to remember every detail of that morning, with the precision of someone who wouldn't allow herself to forget. She took the key card she had hidden in the inner pocket of her coat and pressed it into her palm like a protective charm. She knew that every time this card was swiped to open a door, the hotel system recorded the exact time and room number, and that data couldn't easily be falsified. If Celeste Marlowe's room had been opened at a time when Rose wasn't there at all, then this card would prove her innocence. She also remembered that along the hallway on every floor, there were small cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling, silently recording every set of footsteps passing back and forth. And if someone truly had taken that item, then that person's image had to still be somewhere in the footage. The problem was that she no longer had access to anything. Her employee badge had been taken, and every door was now closed in front of her. But Rose wasn't the kind of person who easily accepted a closed door. Through many years of working here, she had come to know other co-workers, people who had also tasted Vance's cruelty, people who carried the same quiet resentment in their hearts that she did. She thought of a friend in the technical department, someone who had once told her how the data storage system worked. In her mind, she went over the things she needed to do, one step at a time, coldly and clearly, the way she had once organized the work of cleaning hundreds of rooms. When the door to that small room finally opened, and they told her she was allowed to go home and wait for the final decision, Rose stood up and walked out with her back straight and her steps steady. They thought they had just released a broken woman, but in truth, they had just released a woman who had decided to fight, and this time, she wouldn't let anyone rewrite the story of her life with a lie. The next morning, when Rose had just set foot in the hotel to hear the final decision about her fate, she never expected to walk straight into a scene that made the grand lobby seem to hold its breath. In the middle of the luxurious marble-floored entrance hall stood a woman with a perfectly straight posture, wearing an ash-gray overcoat cut with exquisite precision, her silver hair neatly pinned up, every gesture carrying a calm authority that money could never buy. It took Rose a moment to recognize her as the trembling old woman in the thin coat from that snowy night. But the woman standing before her now had nothing left of that pitiful weakness. She stood there as though the entire building belonged to her, and her eyes swept across the lobby with a sharpness that made the surrounding employees lower their heads and look away. This was Margaret Ellison, And when that name was quietly spoken by the assistant beside her, many faces in the lobby went pale. Vance was the first to lose color. He had just stepped out of the elevator, still talking and laughing with a guest, when he froze halfway through at the sight of her. The cup of coffee in his hand tilted slightly, a few drops spilling over the rim. Rose clearly saw the change on his face. It wasn't the surprise of a man unexpectedly meeting an honored guest, but the terror of someone who had just seen the very thing he had prayed his whole life never to face. And in that instant, a missing piece in Rose's mind suddenly locked into place. He hadn't known who she was that night. He had genuinely mistaken her for a helpless outcast. But now, the realization that he had accidentally driven the ultimate owner of the empire out into the freezing storm left him utterly paralyzed with fear. For a hidden pawn like Vance, a mistake this catastrophic meant his entire cover was about to blow, exposing the dark forces he secretly served. Margaret Ellison walked slowly toward the center of the lobby, where Celeste Marlowe sat with a triumphant look, and Vance stood rooted in place. She didn't need to raise her voice. She only had to speak, and the entire lobby fell instantly silent. She said she had been standing there long enough to hear everything, long enough to witness the way an honest employee of her own hotel had been treated like a criminal, without so much as a single scrap of evidence. She turned to look at Rose, and in her eyes there passed something warm that only Rose understood. Then she turned back, her gaze becoming ice cold the moment it fell on Vance. In a voice so gentle it sent a chill through the room, she asked him since when her hotel had adopted a policy of condemning a person based only on the words of an angry guest. Vance stammered, trying to explain, citing rules, citing reputation. But under her gaze, each word of his grew more broken than the last. Margaret didn't bother listening to the rest of those excuses. She raised one hand, a small gesture, but enough to silence him at once. In front of everyone present, she declared that from this moment on, every accusation against Rose was suspended, and an independent investigation would begin immediately, not only into the missing bracelet, but into everything that had taken place in this hotel under Bradford Vance's management. She said she wanted to review all room access data, all hallway footage, and she wanted to know exactly who had done what, and at what time. When Rose heard that, she saw Vance's hand tighten slightly, and for the first time since she had known him, she realized that the man who had always seemed so powerful and triumphant was actually afraid. The old woman she had once saved in the snowstorm, the woman she had thought was only a poor soul in need of shelter, had turned out to be the one person with enough power to overturn the entire game, and now she was standing up to do exactly that, for her. On the other side of the city, in a vast office on a high floor of another tower, Royce Kessler received the call just as he was sipping his evening drink beside the glass window. The trembling voice on the other end of the line belonged to Vance, the pawn he had patiently planted inside the hotel chain many months earlier. Not because he cared about rooms or guests, but because he needed a pair of eyes and ears deep inside his rival's territory. Kessler and Lucian Crowe had long been two opposing powers in the same city, and Kessler had always hungered to swallow whole the line of business Lucian controlled, that empire he had never found a way to touch after so many years. Kessler's problem wasn't a lack of ambition. It was that Lucian seemed to have almost no weakness for him to exploit. The man was cold, guarded, without a wife or children, without habits, without a single crack where a knife could slip in, until today, when Vance frantically reported that the woman named Margaret Ellison had suddenly appeared at the hotel and ordered an investigation into everything. Kessler set down his glass, his finger tapping lightly against the surface of the desk. He had never intended to set a trap for anyone on that snowy night. Everything had only been an accident, a wealthy guest losing her temper over a missing piece of jewelry, and an unlucky housekeeper being blamed for it. Even Vance himself, when he sided with Celeste Marlowe and pushed Rose into the place of a culprit, had only been following the fawning instinct of a cowardly manager trying to please an important guest. But Kessler was the kind of man who could smell opportunity even in a mess that had nothing to do with him. When he heard Margaret Ellison's name, and the way she had stepped in with full authority to declare her ownership, a spark flashed inside his mind, because he knew something very few people in this city knew, that the woman was the only link to Lucian Crowe's heart, the most precious thing the man without weaknesses would be willing to trade his entire empire to protect. In that moment, the petty framing of a housekeeper suddenly became a valuable piece on Kessler's board. He realized that if he played carefully, he could turn this chaos into a thread, leading him closer to Margaret, and through her, closer to Lucian's weakness, than he had come at any point in years. He ordered Vance not to panic, not to retreat, but to keep playing the part of an innocent man cooperating with the investigation, while quietly finding out what that housekeeper was holding, and exactly how important the old woman Ellison truly was to Lucian's world. In a voice so calm it felt cold, Kessler said that sometimes the greatest gift came from the smallest accidents, and that the man who knew how to use someone else's chaos would always be the one standing at the end. He rose and walked to the window, looking down at the city as its lights came on beneath a thin layer of snow. In his mind, a plan began to take shape, not a trap that had been built in advance, but a move improvised from the very mistakes and greed of the men beneath him. He didn't need to know who Rose was, didn't care whether she was innocent or guilty, didn't give the slightest thought to the fate of a poor woman fighting against a false accusation. To him, she was only a stray piece that had happened to fall onto the board in the right place, a tool he could use to follow the trail toward his true target. And that target, from beginning to end, had never changed. Royce Kessler wanted to bring Lucian Crow down, and for the first time in all those years, he felt he had just found the fragile thread that could unravel an empire that had seemed impossible to shake. He smiled alone in the empty room, the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of blood on the wind. When the news that Margaret Ellison had been found safe at her own hotel finally reached Lucian, he was there in less than 1 hour. His black car glided through the hotel gates over the melting snow, and when he stepped into the lobby, the air inside the building seemed to thicken. Employees moved aside, lowering their heads, and no one dared look directly at him. Lucian didn't care about those stares. The only thing he wanted now was to uncover exactly what had happened to the woman he regarded as his own flesh and blood, who had pushed her outside in the middle of a stormy night, and who had brought her to safety. He went to see Margaret first, and it was she who told him about the housekeeper who hadn't hesitated to risk her job to save a stranger she believed was homeless. With a voice full of emotion, she told him about the young woman who hadn't asked what she had to give, the only person in that entire luxurious hotel who had looked at her as a human being rather than as a nuisance to be thrown out. Lucian fell silent as he listened to that story. He asked to meet that girl, and they led him to the back area, where Rose was sitting and waiting while the investigation was underway. When he stepped inside, Rose looked up at him, and she had no idea who the tall man with the icy eyes standing before her was. No idea that this whole city lowered its voice whenever his name was mentioned. To her, he was only one more powerful man walking in to judge her. Lucian asked her why she had been reckless enough to help an unfamiliar old woman when she knew very well it could cost her job. A question he was used to hearing people answer with clever, self-serving, or false words. But Rose only looked straight at him and said something that made him stop still. She said that a person trembling in the cold didn't need a reason to be helped, and that if someone had to weigh the cost before reaching out to save a life, then perhaps what they had lost was far greater than a job. Those words drove straight into some place inside Lucian's chest, a place he had buried for years beneath the frozen shell of power and cruelty. He stood there in silence, looking at the thin woman before him, the woman who had no idea what she had just said, or to whom she had said it, the woman who still held her head high even while being accused of a crime she hadn't committed, and he saw in her a light that had long since vanished from his world. In that moment, an old wound rose inside him again, a wound he had believed he'd learned how to live with. There had once been a kind person in his life, someone who had treated him with unconditional compassion when he was nothing at all, and he hadn't protected that person in time when disaster came. That regret had followed him through all these years, had forged him into the iron-hearted man he was today, a man who had sworn he would never again let any evil person touch the decent souls under his protection. Lucian looked at Rose for a long time, then said softly, in a deep voice far different from the coldness of moments before, that she had saved someone who mattered deeply to him, and he wouldn't allow her to suffer for her kindness. Rose didn't fully understand the meaning behind those words, didn't know that the man who had just promised her that had enough power to turn her entire fate with a mere wave of his hand. She only felt that, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, someone was looking at her without judgment, someone believed her, and when Lucian turned and walked out of the room, the look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer only the anger of a man seeking justice for someone he loved, but also the quiet resolve to protect a stranger who had unknowingly awakened the humanity he thought he had lost long ago. In the days that followed, although the investigation still hadn't reached its end, Rose began to notice strange things happening around her, things she couldn't explain no matter how hard she tried. Her suspension was quietly lifted, and instead of being escorted away or questioned, she was invited back with a measure of respect she had never received before. The hospital debt she had thought was about to be sent to collections was suddenly extended in a way she couldn't understand, as though some invisible hand had stepped in from behind the scenes. When she called to ask about it, they only told her that her file had been reviewed again and that everything was temporarily settled. Rose wasn't the kind of person who easily believed in good fortune falling from the sky. She knew that in this world, nothing was free, and every act of help came with a price. She began to suspect that all of this had something to do with the quiet man who had come to see her that day, the man who had promised that she wouldn't have to suffer the consequences of her kindness. One afternoon, just as Rose left the hotel after her shift, that familiar black car appeared again at the curb, and Lucian stepped out. He said he wanted to invite her for a cup of coffee, not as a favor handed down from above, but as an offer between two equal human beings. Rose hesitated, then agreed, but the moment they sat down inside that small, warm cafe, she asked him directly the question she had been carrying for days. She asked whether he was the one behind the changes happening around her, and if that was true, what he wanted from her in return. Lucian was briefly surprised by such blunt honesty. He was used to people who only knew how to lower their heads and accept favors, or else find ways to take advantage of his goodwill. But this woman looked at his help with the wary eyes of someone who didn't want to owe anyone anything. He admitted that he had intervened, but he said he needed nothing from her. He was only returning a part of what she had done for someone he loved. Rose shook her head. She said she had helped the old woman that night not because she wanted to be repaid, and she didn't want to receive things she hadn't earned with her own hands. She said she was used to standing on her own feet, that even if life pushed her all the way down to the bottom, she still wanted to crawl back up by her own strength, not be lifted by anyone's pity. She said that if he truly wanted to help, then what she needed wasn't money or special treatment, but the chance to prove her innocence, to reclaim her good name through the truth itself. Lucian listened in silence, and inside him rose a respect he hadn't felt for anyone in a very long time. In the world he lived in, where people were willing to sell their dignity cheaply in exchange for a little power or money, the poor woman sitting before him still held something even the richest people couldn't buy, an unconquerable self-respect. He looked at her, and for the first time in a very long while, a rare trace of gentleness passed over his stone-cold face. He said he would respect her wish, that he wouldn't turn her into someone indebted to him, but would help her find the truth, so she could win back what belonged to her by herself. They parted when evening had already begun to fall, with no flowery promises, no intimate gesture that crossed the line, only a quiet understanding between two people who came from two completely different worlds, but both of them could feel that something had just formed between them, something stronger than pity or gratitude, a respect built on the foundation of dignity, and that was the beginning of a bond. No dark conspiracy would be able to break easily. It didn't take Royce Kessler long to realize that the housekeeper who had seemed harmless was actually holding something in her hands that could ruin his entire move. Through Vance's eyes and ears, he learned that Rose had kept the keycard that recorded the access history to the rooms, and that she was quietly trying to find a way to reach the hallway surveillance footage. If the truth came to light, not only would his plan to use the false accusation as a path toward Margaret fall apart, but the spy network he had worked so hard to plant inside the hotel could also be exposed. Kessler understood that he had to silence this girl before she had the chance to speak, and he chose the method men like him always chose, by reaching for the softest place in a person and tightening his grip there. One evening, just as Rose stepped out of the bus stop on her way back to her apartment, two strange men were already waiting in the darkness of the alley. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. They only blocked her path, standing close enough for her to feel the cold threat radiating from them. One of them spoke in a flat voice, saying there were very powerful people who weren't pleased that she kept insisting on digging into things that should have been left alone. He mentioned her hospital debt with a precision that chilled her to the bone, saying that with a single phone call, the entire debt could be demanded at once, and she would lose everything she had left. Then he mentioned Caleb, mentioned the school in Chicago, mentioned the boy's dream of architecture. And in that instant, Rose felt the blood in her body turn to ice. In a soft voice filled with meaning, the man said her younger brother's future was terribly fragile, that even one small incident would be enough to make everything he was building collapse. They gave her a simple choice. Either she stayed silent, handed over the keycard, and admitted she had been mistaken, or she kept being stubborn and watched everyone she loved pay the price. Rose stood in the dark alley, feeling as though the world were closing in around her. This was no longer only about her own good name. They were pointing the blade toward Caleb, the only family she had left, the hope she had sacrificed everything to protect. In one terrifying moment, she almost wanted to give in, to hand them the card and close the matter forever so her brother could stay safe. But then she thought of Tom's words, thought of all the times she had chosen kindness and honesty even when they had cost her dearly, and she understood that if she surrendered to this threat now, she would spend the rest of her life living in fear of people like them. She lifted her head, her voice trembling but firm, and said she wouldn't hand over anything, and that the truth wasn't something to be bargained over. The two men moved closer, the false patience on their faces slowly disappearing, and the air in the alley stretched tight like a wire about to snap. At that life-or-death moment, the headlights of a car swept straight into the alley, and the sound of a car door slamming shut rang through the quiet night. Lucian stepped out of the darkness, followed by several of his men, and his appearance alone was enough to make the two men threatening Rose stop cold. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to strike. He only walked forward and stood between Rose and those two men, his gaze sweeping over them with a coldness that seemed to freeze the entire alley. In a deep, sharp voice, he said that this woman was under his protection, and that anyone who dared touch her or her loved ones had better ask themselves whether they truly understood who they were standing against. The two men looked at him, recognized that face, and terror showed clearly in their eyes. Without saying another word, they slowly backed away, then hurried into the darkness, leaving Rose standing there with her heart still pounding wildly. She turned to look at the man who had just saved her, and for the first time, she began to vaguely understand just how vast and frightening the power surrounding him truly was. After that night in the alley, Lucian knew the time had come to face the person behind everything directly. He had traced Royce Kessler through the statements of the two men he had caught, and when those statements were combined with the keycard Rose had stubbornly held onto, and the surveillance footage his people had extracted, a complete picture slowly began to emerge. Everything pointed in one direction. Vance hadn't acted alone. He was a pawn Kessler had planted, and Kessler had used the entire false accusation against Rose as leverage in an attempt to get close to Margaret. Lucian didn't rush. He arranged a meeting and personally walked into Kessler's den, carrying no weapon, needing no crowd behind him, bringing only the truth and the authority that had been tempered through years of hardship and power. When Lucian entered the room where Kessler was sitting, the air seemed to thicken at once. Kessler tried to keep his calm, inviting him to sit with a faint smile, pretending he didn't understand why Lucian had come. But Lucian didn't sit down. He stood there and placed a file on the table in front of Kessler. Inside was every piece of evidence about the spy network Kessler had planted. The room access history proving Rose's innocence, the calls ordering the threats, every link in the conspiracy Kessler had believed he had hidden perfectly. Lucian didn't raise his voice. His tone was low, steady, and it was that absolute calm that finally made Kessler begin to sweat. He said Kessler had made a mistake very few men dared to make, which was reaching his filthy hand toward the person Lucian treasured most, and that among all the foolish choices a man could make, that was the most foolish one of all. Kessler tried to struggle. He rose to his feet, loudly denying everything, saying those documents proved nothing, that Lucian had no right to walk in here and accuse him. But Lucian only placed one more thing quietly on the table, a recording of Kessler's own voice giving orders to his men, evidence that even his shamelessness couldn't deny. As the recording sounded through the silent room, Kessler's face slowly went pale, and the arrogant confidence of a man who had thought victory was already in his hands began to collapse piece by piece. Lucian told him that he now had everything he needed to turn the entire empire Kessler had worked so hard to build into ashes, that Kessler's business partners would turn their backs on him the moment they learned how reckless he had been, and that the very men who had once feared him would be the first to trample him when he fell. Lucian didn't need to use force. Every word he spoke landed like a sentence with no appeal, and Kessler, the predator who had once smiled when he caught the scent of blood, now stood rooted in the middle of his own room, paralyzed beneath the weight of defeat. Lucian stepped closer, looked straight into Kessler's eyes, and delivered the final words in a voice as light as breath but colder than ice. He said that from this moment on, Kessler was no longer a force in this city, that every door once opened to him would slam shut, and that he would have the rest of his life to regret the day he dared touch the people under Lucian's protection. Kessler opened his mouth as if to say something, but not a sound came out. He understood that he had lost. not through a bloody contest of strength, but through the truth he couldn't deny, and the overwhelming power he had gravely underestimated. Lucian took back the file, turned around, and walked out of the room, leaving behind a man who had lost everything in only a few short minutes. When he stepped outside, the city lights fell across his face, and for the first time in many days, his chest felt lighter, because he knew that the woman who had saved his foster mother and had awakened the humanity he had thought long dead inside him was finally about to have the innocence she deserved restored to her. Royce Kessler's downfall didn't come like a thunderous explosion, but spread quietly and unstoppably, like a crack running along the foundation of a building that had seemed solid. Within only a few days after that confrontation, the evidence Lucian held was sent to exactly the places it needed to go, and the world Kessler had worked so hard to build began to fracture piece by piece. The partners who had once shaken hands and done business with him quietly withdrew. No one wanted to be involved with a man reckless enough to provoke a power the entire city treated with caution. The men who had once knelt before him begging for favors now turned their backs faster than anyone else. Because in the underworld he had once ruled, loyalty existed only as long as power remained, and once that power disappeared, the man who had once stood at the top would fall faster than all the rest. His shadowy investments were exposed. The doors that had once opened wide now slammed shut in his face, and Kessler, the predator who had believed he had found the thread that could unravel an entire empire, was finally the one strangled by his own ambition. It wasn't a punishment handed down by anyone. It was the natural consequence of the sins he had sown with his own hands and reaped with his own life. As for Bradford Vance, the pawn who had sold his conscience to serve Kessler's scheme, he also couldn't escape the day when every mask was torn away. When the independent investigation ordered by Margaret Ellison finally reached its end, the full truth about his role was brought into the light. They discovered that he was the one who had deliberately created the conditions for the false accusation to happen, the one who had helped conceal traces and distort information, the eye Kessler had planted inside the hotel to watch every movement. In a meeting before the entire management board, Margaret personally exposed each of his actions, not with shouting, but with cold and undeniable evidence. Vance, the man who had once arrogantly written other people's names into the violation log, who had given himself the right to judge honest human beings, now stood there with a bloodless face, stammering useless excuses that no one believed anymore. He was fired immediately, stripped of every position and benefit, and the news of his betrayal spread throughout the industry, leaving no place willing to hire him. The man who had once held power over the fate of so many employees beneath him finally lost everything because of his own greed and cowardice, leaving under the contempt of all those who had once been forced to bow their heads before him. Celeste Marlowe, the woman who had lit the fuse of the entire tragedy with her poisonous accusation, also had to pay the price for that cruelty. When the truth was announced, that she had accused an innocent person without a single scrap of evidence, only because of her prejudice and contempt for the poor, the reputation she had carefully built in high society vanished like smoke. The story of how she had treated an old woman on a snowy night, and how she had pushed an honest housekeeper toward legal ruin, passed from one mouth to another, and the glittering world she had once been so proud to belong to began closing its doors to her. Invitations to elegant events grew fewer, then stopped altogether. The people who had once surrounded her to curry favor now quietly avoided her as though avoiding a stain, and the status she had always considered permanent turned out to be more fragile than the ice over a winter lake. She wasn't punished by violence, wasn't imprisoned or threatened, but the price she had to pay was heavier than that. The collapse of the false honor she had used to trample others. As all of this unfolded one thing after another, Rose watched from a distance with a strange feeling, not the gloating pleasure of a victor, but a quiet and thoughtful heaviness. She realized that she had never had to harm any of them with her own hands. She had only clung stubbornly to the truth, held fast to her self-respect, and refused to surrender. And in the end, evil had dug its own grave. Margaret came to her side, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, and said that sometimes justice didn't need revenge, because those who sowed the wind would sooner or later reap the storm, and the only thing an honest person needed to do was never lose themselves in the middle of that storm. One quiet afternoon, when all the storms had gradually settled, Margaret invited Rose to her home, and it was there, beside a warm cup of tea and the flickering fire in the hearth, that she finally told Rose a story very few people in this world had ever been allowed to know. She began by explaining why she had gone out alone in the middle of that snowy night, wearing only that fragile coat, with no car waiting for her, and no one walking beside her. She said that night was the anniversary of the death of the husband she had loved all her life, and every year on that very day, she quietly returned to an old place, a narrow alley tucked behind streets that almost no one remembered anymore. It was the place where, 26 years ago, on a winter night as bitterly cold as that one, her life had changed forever. Margaret said that year, while she and her husband were on their way home after an evening out, they happened to pass that alley and saw a little boy curled up in the corner of a wall, trying to hide from the cold. The boy was about 7 or 8 years old, with no shelter, no one in the world to go back to. She said she could still remember the look in that child's eyes when he lifted his face to her, a look both wary and starving for human warmth. She and her husband couldn't simply walk past him. They brought the boy home, wrapped him in a thick blanket, cooked him a hot meal, and for the first time in a very long while, that little boy slept in a warm room with the feeling of being safe. That night should have been only a passing act of help, but when they looked at the boy sleeping, she and her husband understood that they could never send him back into the cold outside. They decided to adopt him, to give him a home, a name, a real family, and to raise him with all the love they had. That boy, Margaret said with tears shining in her eyes, was Lucian. Rose sat frozen when she heard that. She began to understand the true meaning behind everything that had happened. Margaret said her late husband had always believed in one simple thing, that a small act of kindness could change an entire life, and the truth was that their kindness on that winter night had saved a child who seemed to have no future left, turning him into the strong and loyal man who would later open his arms to protect those who were weak. Every year on the anniversary of her husband's death, Margaret returned to that alley to remember him and to remind herself of the moment that had shaped everything. Then she looked at Rose, smiling through her tears, and said that on the recent snowy night, when Rose had held her by the elbow and brought her somewhere warm without asking what she had to give, Margaret had felt as though she were living that very moment from 26 years before all over again. Only this time, she was the one being saved. She said kindness was like a circle. It moved from one person to another, from one generation to the next, and Rose had unknowingly closed the circle Margaret herself had opened so many years ago. But then Margaret's voice grew lower, and she revealed something that made Rose's chest tighten. She said her heart was no longer as strong as it once had been, that the doctors had warned her about the heart disease quietly wearing away her strength day by day. That was also why the trip back to the old alley that night had carried a special meaning, because deep down, she had thought perhaps it would be the last time she would still have enough strength to return there. She took Rose's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, saying that meeting her on the very night she had thought might be her final journey felt like a gift fate had given her, a reminder that the kindness she and her husband had planted all those years ago was still blooming and bearing fruit in this life. Rose held tightly to the old woman's frail hand, and this time, she was the one who couldn't hold back her tears. She understood that on the night she had thought she was only helping a stranger, she had actually touched a story far larger than herself, a story of human kindness passed on across 3 decades, and that sometimes, a hand reaching out in the darkness could bind destinies together in ways no one could ever have imagined. The day the truth was finally announced before the entire hotel staff was a day Rose would remember for the rest of her life. Margaret Ellison had called a gathering in the very marble-floored lobby where Rose had once been accused beneath so many prying eyes. And this time, the person standing at the center was no longer a housekeeper being escorted away, but a woman about to have everything unjustly taken from her returned. Margaret stood before everyone, her voice gentle yet carrying through the entire hall, declaring that the independent investigation had concluded and that the result was clear beyond dispute. She laid out all the evidence, from the room access history recorded precisely down to the minute, to the images showing that Rose had never set foot in the room at the time the item was said to have disappeared. She stated plainly that this housekeeper was completely innocent, that she had been deliberately framed by people driven by prejudice and dark calculations, and that this hotel owed her an apology nothing could ever fully repay. Then Margaret did something that left the whole lobby stunned. She walked up to Rose in front of everyone present and personally bowed her head to apologize to her. She said that under the roof she owned, an honest human being had been treated like a criminal, and that was something that filled her with deep shame. She apologized for the days Rose had been forced to live in fear and humiliation, for the way her honor had been stained, for the fact that she had been left to face an entire conspiracy alone, one she never should have had to bear. The employees standing around them, the very people who had once watched her being escorted out of the building in disgrace, now looked at her with eyes full of respect and sorrow. Someone quietly wiped away tears. Rose stood there with her heart tangled in 100 emotions, not because she felt triumphant, but because she had never imagined that one day, the most powerful woman in this building would bow her head before a poor housekeeper like her. But Margaret didn't stop there. She said that a simple apology wasn't enough, and that she wanted to give Rose an opportunity she fully deserved. Not out of pity, but because of the qualities she had proven throughout the storm they had just endured. She invited Rose to take on a new position within her corporation, a management role in charge of employee policies and welfare, so Rose could use her own experience and compassion to protect other vulnerable people who worked quietly behind the scenes day and night. Margaret said she needed people who were not only capable, but who also had hearts that knew how to stand in someone else's place, and Rose was exactly that kind of person. Faced with that offer, Rose fell silent for a moment, almost unable to believe what she had just heard. She, the woman who only days earlier had stood on the edge of losing everything, was now being offered a future she had never dared dream of. And then, in that moment, as she looked into Margaret's warm eyes, every scattered piece inside her suddenly came together into one complete picture. The powerful woman standing before her now, the woman who had stepped forward to protect her, who had overturned an entire conspiracy to clear her name, was the same trembling old woman whose elbow Rose had held in the snowstorm that night, the person she had helped without expecting anything in return. She realized that the small act she had thought almost meaningless that night, the very act that had nearly cost her job and left her falsely accused, had turned out to be the seed that had taken root and bloomed into all the miracles unfolding before her now. The kindness she had given freely, without conditions, without needing anyone to witness it, had finally returned to her in the fullest and most meaningful way, and she understood that the words Tom had left behind all those years ago had never been more true. The months that followed passed like a dream Rose had once believed she would never be able to reach. The first thing she did after accepting the new position and the steady income that came with it was settle once and for all the hospital debt that had weighed on her shoulders for 18 long months. That figure of $41,000, which had kept her awake through so many nights, which had followed her like a cold shadow to every plain and meager meal, was finally wiped clean. On the day she signed the document confirming that the debt had been paid in full, she sat in silence for a very long time, her hand reaching for the silver ring around her neck, and for the first time since Tom had gone, she felt as though she could draw one deep breath without any burden pressing down on her chest. In the quiet of her heart, she whispered to her husband that she had done it, that she had held on to the kindness he had left behind, and that it was that very kindness that had led her through the darkest storm of her life. The next great joy came from Chicago, when Caleb called her in tears, his voice trembling with emotion. He told her he had just received a full scholarship for the rest of his education, an opportunity he had never dared dream of, from a scholarship fund for outstanding students facing hardship. He kept asking again and again whether it was real, whether he might be dreaming, and Rose only smiled through the phone and told him he deserved it, that all those nights he had spent working over his drawings had finally been rewarded. She didn't tell him about the quiet hand behind that scholarship, didn't tell him everything she had gone through to protect his future. She only wanted him to live fully inside his own happiness, to be free to pursue the dream he had always carried of designing homes for the poor, without having to worry about the prices that had been paid. But Rose wasn't the kind of person who could simply enjoy her own good fortune and forget those still struggling in the dark. She understood better than anyone what it felt like to be looked down on, to be treated as though she were invisible, to have both her voice and her dignity taken away simply because she did work the world considered lowly. And so, with Margaret's support, she established a fund dedicated specifically to supporting housekeepers and cleaning workers in the hotel industry, the people who labored quietly behind the scenes and were rarely seen by anyone. That fund didn't only provide financial help to those in hardship, but also stood up to protect them from injustice, false accusations, and people who abused power to crush the vulnerable, just as she had once been crushed. Rose personally met with each of them, listened to their stories, and gave them the thing she had longed for most during her darkest days, the feeling of being believed and respected as a human being. And amid all those changes, the relationship between Rose and Lucian slowly warmed in its own quiet way, not rushed, not loud, but gradual and steady, like old wounds healing little by little. They found in each other a kind of understanding neither of them had ever had with anyone else. Lucian, a man far too used to being feared and used by the world, for the first time met someone who looked at him not with terror or calculation, but with sincerity and self-respect. And Rose, a woman far too used to carrying everything alone, slowly learned how to trust and lean on another person without losing herself. They didn't speak much about what was beginning to grow between them, because both of them understood that some precious things didn't need to be named in haste. They simply stayed beside each other, healing the wounds life had left behind, and discovering together that sometimes, from the most painful, broken places, people found the truest and most enduring love. 1 year had passed since the snowy night that changed everything, and Rose's life was now very different from what it had once been. But one thing in her had never changed, and that was the heart that always remained open to people in hardship. On a winter evening, just as Rose was leaving a fundraising event organized by her own foundation, where she had just watched families once helped by the fund gather together in warm laughter, children running happily around the room with little cakes in their hands and joy shining in their eyes, she stepped out onto the street and saw something that made her stop. Beside a quiet dock, a young woman sat curled up on a waiting bench, clutching an old handbag tightly, her face marked by the despair of someone who had just fallen to the very bottom. The girl was sobbing softly, trying to hide her humiliation while hurried strangers passed by without anyone bothering to stop. Rose stopped. In that moment, she seemed to see herself from 1 year earlier, the woman who had once stood in the middle of life's storm with $14 in her pocket and a burden that had seemed impossible to survive. She walked over, gently sat down beside the girl, and asked whether she was all right, whether she needed any help. The girl lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, and through choked sobs, she said she had just lost her job, had just been thrown out of her rented room because she couldn't pay, and now she didn't know where to go on this freezing night, with no family, no one to turn to, and not a single coin in her pocket. Rose listened to every word, without judgment, without rushing, simply sitting there like a friend. Then she took out a business card from the support fund she had built, placed it in the girl's hand, and told her there was a place always ready to help people like her, a place that would give her temporary shelter, a hot meal, and most importantly, a chance to stand up and begin again. The girl looked at the card, then at Rose, her eyes full of disbelief, and asked why a stranger would be willing to help her like this, and how she could ever repay her. Rose only smiled, the same gentle smile she had once given to a trembling old woman on that snowy night long ago. She said she wasn't helping in order to be repaid, and that the girl didn't owe her anything at all. She said there had once been a time when she herself had been in the same desperate place, and a stranger had reached out to save her without expecting anything in return. She told her that the only way to repay kindness wasn't to give it back to her, but one day, when the girl was standing firmly on her own feet and was able to do so, to reach out and help someone else in need, so that kindness would keep moving forward forever. Rose stood up, pulled her collar higher, and walked into the night, not waiting for a thank you, not needing anyone to witness what she had just done. She didn't do it to be praised or recognized. She did it because that was simply who she was, because it was what Tom had left her, because it was the lesson Margaret and Lucian had taught her about the strength of compassion. As her figure slowly disappeared beneath the dim yellow streetlights, the young girl remained sitting there, gripping the business card in her hand as though holding on to a spark of hope that had just been lit, and in her heart, a quiet promise had also begun to form, that one day, she too would become the person who extended that warm hand to someone else. And just like that, the circle of kindness that so many people had protected and passed on through the years continued to turn, quietly but steadfastly, from one heart to another. Rosalind Hayward's story does not close with a resounding victory or a miracle dropped from the sky, but with a simple truth we sometimes forget in the rush of our own lives. Kindness never asks whether anyone is watching. It doesn't demand a reward, doesn't need witnesses or praise. It is simply given in silence from a sincere heart. And yet the miracle is that even when no one sees it, life still quietly remembers everything. Rose had no idea that on the night she held the elbow of a strange old woman in the middle of a snowstorm, she was planting a seed that would change her entire fate. She reached out her hand not because she wanted to be repaid, but because she believed no human being deserved to be alone in the cold, and it was that very belief that carried her through the darkest days and into a dawn she had never dared dream of. In a world where people often judge one another by appearance, by what they wear or how much money they carry in their pockets, Rose looked at a weary old woman and saw a human being worthy of respect, and that way of seeing is what truly defines the value of a person. Every morning when Rose wakes, she still looks at the words Tom left behind, that kindness is the only thing no one can ever take from her. And now she fully understands the meaning of those words. Around her neck, the worn silver wedding ring still rests on its chain, pressed close to her heart like a gentle reminder that love and compassion are never truly lost. They only change form and continue on through the hands that know how to give. That ring is no longer only a symbol of loss, but has become the witness to a journey. The journey of a woman who chose to hold on to kindness even when life seemed to have taken everything from her, and in the end was saved by that very kindness. If Rose's story has touched someplace in your heart, please leave a like and share this video with the people you love, so this beautiful message of compassion can travel even farther and warm many more hearts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so every day you can hear more meaningful and deeply moving stories. We'd truly love to know how you feel about today's story. What do you think of Rose's act on that snowy night? And if it were you, would you have dared to reach out your hand the way she did? Please leave a few lines in the comments below to share the most honest feelings from deep within your heart, because every word you share is a precious source of encouragement for us to continue bringing you stories that touch the soul. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this entire story. We wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and happiness filling each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.